This lecture will deal with a critical introduction to 1st and 2nd Samuel. The books of Samuel and Kings together provide a continuous history of Israel from the rise of Israel's monarchy under Saul to the end of the monarchy at the fall of Jerusalem in 586. Both of these books, Samuel and Kings, are part of the former prophets in the Hebrew Bible, which divides up the Bible into law, prophets, and writings, but then the prophetic books are former prophets, which are more historical books, and then latter prophets, which are more what we would call prophetic books. Samuel is named after the prophet and judge. He's the book's major character. Kings is named after the fact that it gives a history of the monarchy. The Septuagint closely connects Samuel and Kings by labeling them 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th kingdoms. As far as the authorship of both Samuel and Kings, we can say that they're unknown. Samuel could not have written the book of Samuel since he dies in 1 Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Samuel are originally one book. In Jewish tradition, Samuel is a prophetic book. Actually, both of these are prophetic books, so it assumes that a prophet wrote the book, whoever it was. Critical scholars ascribe both both the books of Samuel and the books of Kings to the Deuteronomists, the theory of Martin Note, that considers the Deuteronomists to be the author of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, as well as Deuteronomy. The archaeological setting of Samuel is the Iron Age. The events of Samuel take place around 1050 to 970 BC, roughly the end of the Iron Age 1. Philistines had iron technology. Israel did not. Philistines did not allow Israelites access to iron technology, and that gave them an advantage to control the Israelites and prevent them from arming themselves, as you'll read about in 1 Samuel chapter 13. One of the critical problems of the book of Samuel is its text. The Masoretic text of Samuel is among the least well preserved of all the books of the Hebrew Bible. This is evident from comparisons with the Greek Septuagint. The Dead Sea Scrolls in Hebrew also confirm that many of the Septuagint readings seem to be superior to the Masoretic reading. The Dead Sea Scroll texts are 4Q Samuel A, 4Q Samuel B, and 4Q Samuel C. But in turn, they help us to recover the original as one does textual criticism. I'll give you an example of where the text proves to be a little problematic. And the question is, how tall was Goliath in the famous story of David and Goliath? Well, according to 1 Samuel 17:1, in the Masoretic text, he was 6 cubits and a span. A cubit's about 1.5 feet. A span is a hand width. And so that would be well over 9 feet, almost 10 feet, 6 cubits and a span. Whereas the Septuagint, supported by 4Q Samuel A, says that he was 4 cubits and a span. That would make him about 6 foot 9 inches. That would be, roughly the size of a typical NBA player. But he would not be as colossal as a 10-foot giant. Now, there are many such problems throughout the book, but despite those problems, the essential teaching is the same. It doesn't fundamentally affect the theology of the book or the message of the book, but it is a bit of an annoyance that it has more problems than most. By the way, that some translations are beginning to put that alternative rendering for 1 Samuel 17:4 in their margins. I believe the New Living Translation does that. an outline of the book. You have the story of Samuel in 1 Samuel 1 through 7. You have the reign and failure of Saul in 1 Samuel 8 through 15. You have the rise of David in 1 Samuel 16 through 2 Samuel 5 and verse 10. You have the reign of David in 2 Samuel 5:11 through 20:26, and then there's an appendix at the end, chapters 21 through 24. I'd like to at least touch on some of the more important things in terms of the content of this book. You have the rise of Samuel in the first 3 chapters. He had been dedicated to serve the sanctuary by his mother, Hannah, in chapter 1. He was vowed as a votive offering to the sanctuary. He was raised by Eli the priest and was considered a priest, even though that was not he was not a Levite by birth. By adoption he was. Eli in turn had his own sons, but they were corrupt, Hophni and Phinehas. And Samuel will become both a prophet and a judge, as well as a priest, in this section of the book. The next section of the book deals with the capture of the ark. There was a battle at Ebenezer and Aphek, in between those 2 cities, and the ark was captured by the Philistines. And wherever it went, the Philistines were struck with boils and had all kinds of problems. And so eventually they put it on a cart and sent it back to Jerusalem, to Judah. But it ended up being stored in an obscure village, Kiriath Jearim, and ceases to be prominent in Israel until the time of David. This will lead to the rise of Saul. The ark was the symbol of the kingship of Yahweh, the idea that was recognized in the book of Judges. And with that symbol of the ark gone, and with the Philistine threat, there was a clamoring for there to be a king. And so they come to the old man Samuel in 1 Samuel chapter 8, come to a site called Ramah, and ask that he make someone king. Now Samuel was offended. He, after all, was Israel's judge. But God tells him to go ahead and grant them a king, though warn them that the king would be a tyrant, and gives a description that reminds one a lot of Solomon's reign. Well, how is it that Saul becomes king? And it's rather complicated, and often source critics describe these actually 3 times Saul's going to become king, and they ascribe it to contradictory sources. But it's better to take it simply as a complex process. So initially they come to Ramah to Samuel and say, we'd like to have a king. Samuel goes out and finds Saul, and Saul happened to be chasing a donkey at the time, but when he finds him, he pours oil on him and anoints him as king. But nobody recognizes him at that point. So they have another assembly at Mizpah, 1 Samuel 10, and he was presented before the assembly. He was anointed officially in a public setting and made king. But not all the tribes recognized him yet. So he leads the army. They have a battle at Jabesh Gilead. Jabesh Gilead was where the Benjaminites had gotten their wives, by the way. And not incidentally, Saul was a Benjaminite, so he had a bit of allegiance to Jabesh Gilead. So he had a victory at Jabesh Gilead, fighting off the enemies of Israel. And then they have another assembly in 1 Samuel 11, and he's made king for the 3rd time, but this time all the tribes recognize him, thus making him the first king of all Israel. But his kingship doesn't go well. Ultimately, God rejects him as king. Saul assumed a priestly role, offering sacrifices that only priests were allowed to perform, so God said he would seek out a man after his own heart who would replace Saul's rule. 1 Samuel 13:11 through 14. Of course, that man after God's own heart will ultimately be David. It comes to a complete head when he's officially rejected as king. Saul refused God's command through Samuel to carry out holy war against the Amalekites in 1 Samuel 15, and Samuel basically tells him that you have been rejected as king. And that'll lead to the story of the rise of David in 1 Samuel 16, verse 1 through 2 Samuel 5 and verse 10. So after that confrontation with Saul, Samuel seeks out his successor. He goes to, the Lord leads him to Jesse, who was father of 8 sons. He goes through all the sons, and it turns out that David is the one. Jesse was from Bethlehem in Judah, and so Samuel anointed David as Saul's replacement. Though again, nobody but the family would know anything about this at this point. David is going to come to Saul's court later in that chapter. Saul went into a state of depression after being told that God had rejected him as king, and they sought someone to relieve his dejection, and it turns out that David had a reputation as a musician, so he first comes to the court to play his harp and to relieve Saul's depression. And while he's there, he becomes a close friend of Jonathan, Saul's son. Later on, he will marry Michal, Saul's daughter. Now, it's David's defeat of Goliath that makes him a national hero. And this provoked Saul into jealousy, as the women of Israel saying, Saul has killed his thousands, but David his 10,000s. And Saul suspects, correctly as it turns out, that David is the one that was going to replace him as king. And so he threatens to kill him, actually attempts to a couple times, and David is forced to flee. While he's on the run from Saul, he wanders here and there throughout the territory of Judah, but eventually he ends up joining forces with the Philistines, of all people. Left the territory of Israel for Philistine territory and formally became an ally of the Philistines, though in fact, when he said he was going to go attack Judah, he attacked the Amalekites instead, and would give the plunder to the elders of the people of Judah, all of which was a way of preparing for becoming king later on, making the people of Judah thinking he's a good guy. And he was dishonest and deceitful towards the Philistines. He was playing a kind of a con game. But we'll continue this in the next video.